Hey folks, Rob here, bringing another video on tactics. This is going to be part of our 101 series, and it's defending in ASL. Now, a little caveat there, I'm not the best at defense. It is one of the harder aspects of the game to, I think, grasp. Attacking is relatively easy. You find a weakness in your enemy's line and you attack there. With the defense, you have to anticipate everything that your opponent is doing as well as what you have to do yourself in order to deny those victory conditions. Typically, victory conditions, which we're going to get into, are written so that they are for the attacker, and your job in the defense is basically to deny those victory conditions to the attacker. But it's very difficult because, again, usually you're undermanned. At the end of the day, this is a game, a simulation, and you're never going to have enough resources to do everything that you want to do. So we're going to cover some basic tactics that might seem a bit much, but the general concept is still applicable to the game. So let's get into that. Now, there's a couple of resources that we're going to be using. One is from an old general magazine. It's Tactics 101. Now, if you don't have the general, I'm perfectly understandable. It's available on that link up there in Gamesquad. Jim McLeod, deceased member of the ASL community, posted that back in 2009 or something like that. And with permission from Mike McGrath, and the contents of that article are uploaded there at GameSquad. So definitely go to that link, and it's just like he says, 13 steps to improve your game. Now, this is attacker defender based articles, so it's not strictly defense, but it's a very good article to read regardless. And then, of course, there's always Jim Bishop. He's quite prolific in writing, and he has a nice article on defenses as well. So definitely influenced this video, and I recommend you read that one as well. It's the links right there for his blog. And then lastly, we have from the seller number 11. Well, that's Lefranc Terrer. Unfortunately, it's out of print, and I don't have it myself, so I've never read the article. But in 11, there is an article called Player's Guide to Self-Defense by Toby Pilling. Mr. Bishop there alludes to it and thinks highly of it. So if you have access to that one, by all means, be sure you've read it. I'm sure you have at this point anyways. So what we're going to be covering is some considerations, and this is where the METT-TC and the former OCOCA, now called that, acronyms come in, because there are military intelligence terms that help you consider things like terrain, enemy dispositions, etc. And you have to factor all that in. So we're going to use those military intelligence terms to help define the battle space, which will help define your objectives as a defender. And then we're going to cover the actual objectives themselves, types of defense, and then some miscellaneous points at the end. All right, so what's METT-TC? Some of you already seen some videos from, well, myself. I outdo the ACOCA ones, the terrain analysis ones, and I've seen Neil from ASL Academy do the METT-TC and others as well. But basically, it's just a mnemonic to help you remember for planning purposes things like mission, enemy, terrain, etc. You can see it there. Mission is basically your VCs. SSRs, you can see examples there. Again, they're written from the attacker perspective. So though that can be quite wordy, some victory conditions are quite wordy. The way that they're put together, it doesn't make sense, but they're always written from the perspective of the attacker's objectives. And you as a defender, again, your job, along with the SSRs, is to know those so that you can deny them. Enemy is clearly the attacker, OB. Terrain and weather, this is where we're going to use the OAKOC acronym. It used to be called ACOCA, but military likes to change stuff periodically, and for whatever reason they decided to flip avenues of approach to the beginning of the acronym. So troops are your defending OB, those are your own, and then you have the time available, which is just scenario length, which is very critical. Now the last one, civilian considerations, typically it's NA. The only time it might apply is usually it's by SSR. You might have partisans, or you might have civilian interrogation, that kind of thing available. Some scenarios, but typically it's NA for our purposes here, so we're going to ignore that one. But the preceding 5 are very important. And then we're going to look at the OAKOC. This is the terrain analysis part. Observation fields of fire, basically what you can see and what you can shoot. You have avenues approached, basically how is the attacker going to meet his victory conditions. You have the key terrain, which if you lose it, you've lost the game. So this is very vital. And it may not necessarily be a target building that one of the victory conditions states it must control. It could be the area around it or a key building in the way of reaching that building. If you lose that, then you lose a lot of your impetus. We have obstacles. So this includes natural and man-made that you can use to slow or channel or direct the attacker. Ideally, you want to direct them into your kill zones. And then cover and concealment is using the terrain to maintain adequate protection from enemy fire, maintaining your concealment as long as possible, and then deciding whether or not to drop it if you want to shoot it. All right, we're going to be using a couple of scenarios that I played as examples as we go through, and this is going to be one of them. So this is ASL 51, the taking of Takruna, between the New Zealanders attacking an overwhelming number of Italians in Tunisia in 43. Now, the Italians set up a defense, and as we said, this is atypical. Normally, you have more attackers than defenders. In this case, you have 11 Italian squads, and there's only 6 elite 458s coming in from the Anzac. However, they got a couple of heroes, and they got weapons. They're definitely superior to the Italians, and you're going to find them whittling away. So what are the objectives of the defense? You've got to look at your victory conditions. So in this particular case, we have New Zealanders win if they control this hex here. Your job as an Italian in this case is to defend against that happening. So we can do that a couple ways. First of all, a little preamble. So this is actually a fortified set of cluster of buildings, a small little town on top of a hill. You can see it's actually a cliff surrounded on 6 sides. And unbeknownst to the New Zealander, there's a tunnel that connects these 2 hexes. This is the only normal way of entering and exiting this hex. You can only do it with 1 squad at a time, maybe with a couple of SMCs, but 1 squad at a time in your route phase or your movement phase can make their way from back and forth. And this is how the Italians reinforce this location. You cannot use this as an Anzac, so you're going to have to scale the sides of the cliff in order to reach the top to control the objective. Again, that's your victory condition. So as a defender, you want to deny that as much as possible. And that's going to entail you setting up certain defenses and looking at the terrain around you, knowing that at some point you're going to have to start falling back to your central defense, maybe have some outlying positions, but you're going to have to eventually collapse around your center and help defend that as much as possible before you get whittled away. Now, of course, you're going to have superior firepower chewing you up as you're moving on the hills, so it's going to be a very difficult task. This is a very difficult scenario, I think, for the Anzac to do, unless you get really lucky with some of your shots. But as a defender, you must at some point give up terrain to delay the attacker. You must be able to ensure that you can fall back in enough order that you don't completely disintegrate. And this also includes having fallback positions that allow you to recover when you're broken. So you want to have your leaders, some of your leaders can be in the front, some of them should be behind, ready to receive all the broken units that trail back and quickly patch them up and send them back into the action. You have to decide, do you have strong points in which you hold on to as long as possible, or do you give those up if do you even have them, depending again on the scenario setups. And whenever possible, you should have some kind of reserve so you can plug gaps as they appear in your defense. Now again, as a defender, you're hampered with not knowing where the attacker is coming from, but if you have good setups, if you have good interlock and fire, a lot of covering fire for each of the units, then it'll make your job a little bit easier. And again, you can use things like the terrain or obstacles to help channel the attacker to where you want to go. So the reason I'm using this example here is one of the first things that we have to consider is time. The scenario length is to your advantage. In this case, we have 8 turns for the Anzac to get on top of the hill. Now you look at your climbing rules. Climbing state, you must start here at the base. It takes you a full movement phase to get up the side of the cliff, and then you can advance off it in the advance phase. All right, all well and good, except what if you have a defender in this location that's still active? You're now engaged in combat. Unless you destroy the guy in combat, you don't win. You've denied this victory condition because he doesn't control that hex. Which means, when does he have to be at the base of the cliff to climb it? I would say that at least by turns 5 or 6, he must be, the Anzac must be in position in one of these hexes here, even in this hex here, as long as you're in crest status, you can climb, or any one of the surrounding 6 for that matter. You have to be adjacent with by turns 5, 6, because you're going to climb it over turns 6, 7, and then you're going to have turns 7 and 8 to kill whatever's there, assuming you haven't shot it up with your machine guns. So this right now is a timeline, so we can we can bear in mind that it's unlikely if he's not in position by 7 or 8, you probably won. Don't celebrate too early, because there's always something fluky that could happen, but the attacker in this case is hampered by the time which you as a defender can use to your benefit. All right, so we know that he has to be somewhere in this area by turns 5, 6. Otherwise, he's not going to be able to climb it in time and dominate it. Again, if he manages to shoot up your defense and these guys are nobody's here, then he can just come up in 7 and occupy an 8. That's all fine and well. But remember, we also have a hidden tunnel. As long as you have some kind of reserve back here, you can always filter a squad up there and just keep somebody up there whenever as long as possible. And again, you're going to deny him those victories. So he has to work his way up through all this open ground. Probably going to set up a fire base over here somewhere just so that he can eradicate whatever's sitting up top there and cover his advance. But again, as a defender, you want to look at your scenario length because you need to use it to your advantage. And that part of that is understanding the terrain and how long it's going to take him to move and achieve what he's going to get. All right, this is another example, one that I just played online. The videos are up, should be 3-parter. And this is Vok am Rhein from Lone Canuck Publishing, number 11, Penny Packets, which sees the Germans defending basically the small little hamlet encircled in red, while they come in from the 2 flanks. North is at the bottom, so they're approaching from the south, or I should say more appropriately, this is a fire base with 4 heavies, which is ridiculous. 2 quad 50s coming on in half tracks, and then a couple of other half tracks with a 37 long, which is 8 IFE. So that's a lot of firepower in the fire base, while this is the elements of the, I believe, 2nd Battalion that are coming in from the flank to secure this objective. So why are we using this? Remember, we have 8 turns. We're looking at a scenario length. We have 8 turns for the Americans to occupy every stone building in the, or every building within the boundaries of the red perimeter. So this kind of a defense would be more like a hedgehog. So you deploy elements forward. In this case, we have our own machine guns up there. We have a couple squads here. And this is designed basically to slow down the Americans. You're buying time for terrain. At some point, these guys are either going to die in place or you're going to more likely have to pull them back. Remember, you want to slow them down. At the same time, you want to collapse backwards. So you leapfrog your elements back. You have other guys in strategic locations that try and interdict as much as possible. And in this case here, we wouldn't set up strong points per se, although we do set up strong positions, not necessarily the same thing. So in this case here, we have a heavy and a medium with a leader up on the first level. I've set them back behind some level 1 obstacles so that they have to be more selective where they set up their fire bases. And in this case, we have 2 mortars that are going to drop some Willy Pete on them, which makes sense. A, you smoke them off, and B, it causes a morale check as well as loss of concealment. And then I also have 2 sets of heavy machine guns, which are going to be designed to punch through anything that's in the way. All right, so that's the attacker perspective. So how do we deny that? Again, you look at your terrain. We look at all our nice little killing fields, nice wide open, and you site yourselves accordingly. Now, this it seems like an attractive site, but, and this comes with experience, and myself, I just learned this one when I played this one. This little walled compound seems like a good spot to have a strong point. It's got stone buildings, so you're at +3. It's got upper level, which means you can see over the walls, no problem. And you have good fields of fire because you can see all the way to the board edge on both sides. If you're up on the first level, you can see the front, all this open space here, which means all these are very vulnerable to your fire, as well as the half tracks for their part as well. Remember, you can always shoot a half track. You're only going to get a +2 from the frontal arc for crew exposed, and they must be crew exposed to fire, so they're always going to be a juicy target. However, you have to consider fallback plan as well. With quad 50s, with 4 heavy machine guns and 2 81 mortars dropping white phosphorus, eventually you're going to get overwhelmed in this location if if he deals with this. If he doesn't just bypass it using the woods as much as possible. And secondly, because of the nature of the terrain, you get some half tracks around the side here. Keep them at a certain distance so they don't get shot up too easily. And then you can quickly interdict him as he attempts to move back. So as a defender, you also got to be aware of fallback plans. So you can, that's a bad shot. Obviously, you're not taking that one. But you do cover this area here. Now this guy is more or less sacrificial. He's going to stay there and die as long as possible. These guys here will eventually have to leave the building, and they're going to have to fall back. But they have to fall back through open areas. So again, you must be aware of that. When you set up your strong points, make sure that you have good cover to fall back on. This is not optimal. However, it might be a worthy trade-off in this case because we want to occupy the fire base and not give them complete freedom of movement. At the same time, you can put all your resources into the one basket because it's easy to isolate and be destroyed. And then the last point we'll talk about for this example here is having a reserve. So in this scenario, the victory condition is quite simple. Provided the Germans have not amassed 25 or more CVP, Americans win a game end by controlling all the buildings within 5 hexes of this road intersection. So we know that this is our do or die, our key terrain, and we must protect as much as possible, and we have to have some kind of flexibility. So in this case, I have 2 mortars set up hip. Remember, they can set up in concealment terrain hip and in placed, unless SSR specifies otherwise. I have a squad above a foxhole behind the wall, so they'll have the wall advantage, and this allows them to interdict units that want to just walk up. Of course, I'm probably going to be getting this right in the face, couple of heavies, throw in the squads if it's in range. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the squads are just out of range, but that's still 12 firepower halved with a 7-0. So it's a lot of fire. That could easily pin this guy, maybe bust his concealment at a minimum, maybe break him. In this case, I managed to break him with that shot. But his purpose here is to deny these guys just waltzing down the center if your center fire base doesn't do it or it's occupied elsewhere. So this is basically my mobile reserve. I have this guy here. I've got a guy here. I've got this guy here. He's kind of like a forward/mobile reserve. He's able to support these elements, cover for them while they're moving. And then I've got another fire base set up back here that I can move forward depending which way he comes. I can move to the right if he comes south of this tree line, or I can keep them where they are in case he comes through the paths through the woods. All right. So whenever possible, you must have some kind of reserve forces that you can draw upon to deny that victory condition. Let's look at one more. All right, this is another one that I played recently, Bach am Rhein number 10, Line in the Sand. The premise of this is you have some American airborne that are basically on a road between this intersection here and this intersection here, maximum of 2 MMCs per hex. And then you have 2 groups of Germans coming on from the right in phases. So this is coming on turn 2. These guys half tracks with squads and some Mark IVs are all entering on turn 1. And the objective is twofold. So let's look at that quickly. Again, this is one of those wordy victory conditions, but remember that's always geared towards the attacker. So in this case, provided the Americans have no unbroken MMC on or adjacent to the road that we talked about. So we start at F5, and we basically follow the road all the way down to here. As long as there's no good order or I should say unbroken MMC adjacent to this, the Germans win at game end if they can exit 8 squad equivalents off of the left side. And then it goes on to define what the different AFEs are worth in terms of squad equivalency. Now that sounds like a very difficult scenario for the Germans, and it is. Because in this case, we were looking at the defense, and we have a bunch of, as we said, paratroopers, various states. Yes, they have dismantled weapons, but they've also got 3, I believe it's 3 bazookas, which is really going to do a decent job on the armor. In addition, they also have what Lone Canuck gave them was gammon bombs, which is like an ATMM. It's just for the Americans, Special Forces airborne types, and it's a jerry-rigged explosive, and it gives them a -2 in their close combat die rolls, so it's quite lethal. And they're only Mark IVs, which are great. However, you're not talking about Panthers here. And these are airborne troops. So as a defender, what do we do in this scenario? We know that we have to have some good order units within the road condition, the road for the victory condition. At the same time, we have to deny all this space for him to send his 8 squad equivalents off of the west side. So how do we do that? The Germans move first. Well, the Germans are also hampered by an SSR of using up half of their moves, so they're not even going to be able to reach you in the first case. So assuming that they use the road and the road bonus crew exposed, this is what you can do as a defender. You set this up and you do a quick calculation. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He used up already half of it, so he's only got 6.5 move, of which he's already used up 5. That gives him 1.5 move, so that'll be the 1, and then you can stop hatches down. But notice he's got no line of sight. So the first turn is just getting onto the board. There's no way, short of excessive speed, that he's going to be able to come up here and do any funny business. If I wanted to stay up here, I'd probably go hatches down. I would have to stay in motion because I've used up all of my move. And therefore, as a tanker, I'm going to be paying some severe penalties for my shots. First of all, my 8 firepower machine guns are going to be quartered, and then I'm going to be doubling my lower die on my main armament because of the penalties of being in motion. So right now, as a defender, you know you've got 1 turn to breathe. The German moves up into position. Let's assume that he plays it safe and stays back here for now. It's not going to be the American turn, and we have to bear in mind the condition, all right? So as long as no unbroken MMC is on or adjacent to that road, the Germans win at game end. So what's the first thing we can do? We can either start breaking up into half squads, and we start filtering in adjacent to these buildings, right? So we keep a mobile reserve. That guy was overstacked. You start spreading out, you cover your objective, and you notice that while we're doing this, we're also spreading out enough to cause discomfort to the enemy. Whether or not you assemble your guns in their defending fire phase is entirely up to you. But again, you want to stay out of line of fire as long as possible, while denying him the space to do the same. So what we've done in this particular case on our turn 1 is we've now made it almost impossible for him to clear everything out, because every unit is going to be sitting on top of a building adjacent to a road, which means they've wasted 1 turn just to get into position. All right, so these guys are not even in position to attack yet while your other reinforcements are coming on. And using the time on the scenario card will allow you as a defender to start setting up a more in-depth defense. At the same time, you're denying him access to easy routes up to the north and or the south. Now again, you look at the terrain. We've got a mass of woods here, which means the vehicles are not going to be going through it. So you're going to have dismounted infantry. And it's going to take a full move just to get here. So one turn to move up adjacent to the woods, the second turn to dismount, come through the woods, and on the third turn you might be on the edge of the wood line, ready to start doing your business of clearing, but you've just cut off 3 turns as an attacker. All right, so by the defender spreading out in this fashion, we've just hampered the attacker's ability to clear us all out, because he cannot leave a single half squad adjacent to a road. He must attempt to clear everything off. And again, these are Americans. That's a dummy stack. But we got bazookas. We have a lot of mediums, and we even have a 60 mortar that can cause a little bit of chaos as well with some white phosphorus. All right, so again, objectives of the defense: you want to deny the enemy their VC. Use the scenario length to your advantage, knowing that if you can delay him long enough, you might be able to stop his VC accomplishment. There's some point you're going to have to give up this terrain, either fall back or you die in place. In a situation like this, we also have mist in effect, so that's going to help you with your fallback if you wanted to. Remember, you always have the freedom to stay back behind the main road, and then all you got to do is advance in. This keeps you safe from shooting mostly, at denying or opening the terrain up for somebody else to take it. But at least you're going to be safe, and then you can just reoccupy it later on. Or, should the Germans move in adjacent, you're still protected to some degree. You can easily blast them. Again, strong points. This one here is really not suitable for strong points because of the fluid nature of the attack. However, you can still set up some hasty defenses. And again, you want to deny the enemy his time, because if he spends time shooting, he's not moving. And whenever possible, you need to have a reserve. So again, in this particular mission, we don't need to worry about a reserve, because the objective is to keep one unit at least alive, unbroken, adjacent to this road segment, and then you'll deny him his victory. So, all right. So another example, this one is Gross Deutschland number 20, the Nut that is Cherkaskoya, again from Lone Canuck Publishing. Giant monster scenario, a lot of fun to play. It took me about 50 hours to play it, or 60. This is an example of a layered defense in depth. You've got strong fortifications, minefields, obstacles, what have you in the front. Yes, there's gaps, but again, we have our guns trained on these gaps so that we could interdict them whenever possible. Behind the wire and mines, you've got trenches, and we even have a cluster of trenches back here. And basically, the German has to get all his, not all of his forces, a set number. I believe it's 135 or more VP off the north edge. Now, again, that seems like a lot, but this is a huge monster scenario. There's no way about that. You'd have probably, I think I counted like 240 VP total. So meeting the victory condition is not that difficult, provided you can punch through a layered defense. This is not what typically is going to happen in a game. There's limitations to depth of layered defense. First of all, it depends on the resources you have. Normally, you don't have this. Let's look at the scenario card to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. All right, this is what we're looking at. Now, this is a 3-pager. So you have 1 page for the information for the scenario, 1 page for all your forces, and the Russian has their own page as well. So you can see that you have a lot of units that will enable you to set up something like this. This is typically not the case. This is glorious if you can get it. Very difficult to play because, again, there's just so many moving pieces. You have OBA, you've got planes, you got fortifications, some hidden, some not, and all that kind of fun. You've got a dozen or so T-34s coming on as a reinforcement. So it's very difficult to punch through it, but it's a good example of a layered or in-depth defense. But it's not your typical scenario. These ones are not the ones you're typically going to be playing. So let's look at a more realistic scenario. All right, so this is Crisis at Kasserine, number 284. Again, Dave and I played this a couple times. Well, we never finished it for a couple of reasons, but and I did play it solo, and again, the Germans lost, very difficult. But this is another example of an in-depth or layered defense. So we have a belt of mines anti-personnel as well as anti-tank. We have set up several positions set up in depth. Now this is Dave's setup, not mine. And Dave is very good at the defense because he just the way he thinks. And you can see that all these vehicles overlap and cover each other. So we always have good lines of fire coming down the desert, a little bit of crisscross action, so we have overlapping. We've got all our units here on fortifications in the ground behind Craig, which means that yes, you can't shoot through it because it's an obstacle, but at the same time you can't be shot. Now all the Germans have for their part is a couple of hillocks back here where they can have some guns, which you can see over the crags, no problem. But again, you only have a mixture of Italian guns, which aren't the greatest, and you got a couple of mortars, and you got an 88 long. The rest of it is all units in wadis that are trying to punch through your weaknesses. But you notice the spread out defense nature. All right. Yes, these are all fairly spread out because the Germans have 2 sets of OBA, including a Nebelwerfer, which is a harassing fire template. So it's 2 hexes away from the center hex, and it can do a serious number on units. But when they're spread out like this, it is much harder for them to drop a template down on the on somebody. So assuming it lands here, for this is the pre-registered hex, I chose poorly. I've only got 1 unit that's within it. But you can see with this template, if you want to impact multiple units, this may be your best bet if you're lucky enough for a rocket to land there. So you can't depend on a rocket to go where you want to. And having a spread out nature the way Dave set it up will preclude that from killing your units as much as possible. It is very dependent on the map size, whether or not it's feasible, and again, units. This is a large scenario. You have a lot of units that gives you the freedom to set up in this kind of layered defense. So provided you have a decent map size and you have enough units in your OB, you can conduct an in-depth layered defense, which is the best kind of defense, I think, depending on the situation. These units here can always fall back as required. And again, their point is to delay Germans from exiting off the board in the 12.5 turns that they have to do it. So the Germans got 12.5 movement phases. I say Germans because Italians always end up dying. So we have 12.5 movement phases to breach this obstacle, whether you go around it and subject yourself to fire or punch through it, and you have sappers to do that, so it makes it a little bit easier. But you still have to fight your way through all this terrain. You're fighting for every step just to exit off the board. So barring good dice rolls on your part, it's probably going to be difficult for the German to succeed because we have a good layered defense. What would you shoot at as an attacker? There's so much spread out. Do you focus on the armor with your guns? Do you focus on the units in the trenches? It's a lot to take on as an attacker because we have a nice layered defense. So if you look at a hedgehog, all right, we'll go back to penny packets. This is more like a hedgehog defense. Again, we have forward elements. Our setup limitation is this red line. I don't know if you can see it here. This is basically our setup perimeter that we have to contain ourselves in, with the final objective being this village. So anything that's outside the village is going to be falling back at some point. So as we said, we must have covered routes, either coming through the woods here. You're going to do some kind of fancy maneuver to come in this location. You're going to have to fall back at some point, collapsing inwards in order to protect your victory condition. And other variations of that are basically deliberate and hasty. So in the example there with the paratroopers on the road, that would be an example of a hasty defense. You don't have time to set up obstacles. You don't have time to rubble. You don't have time to kindle grain, which is one defensive tactic you can do, is to deny enemy positions, is kindle buildings. Typically, that's why they add the SSR kindling as NA, because it makes it even more difficult for the attacker when you start burning the place down. But with a hasty, you must still have some kind of fallback plan. Usually you're playing some kind of delay game at that point. and you must have some way of keeping your units alive long enough to deny the victory condition. And then the deliberate is using obstacles if you have them, or just natural terrain to slow down the enemy. You can also use things like bore sighting, pre-registered hexes. In the case of, remember, for bore sighting, as long as the attacker is setting up on board, or sorry, the attackers coming from off board, and you've got mediums, heavies, and mortars, and guns, you can start bore sighting, barring SSRs, and therefore you can pick likely targets that will impede or have a good job of reducing the enemy's strength. Again, this is something Dave is really good at, is identifying strong points and knowing where to set your DC so you can blow them up. Let's look at that as an example. I always go back to this one. All right, so we have a good old Stalingrad. So we played this a long time ago, Dave and I. We played one of the campaigns, and I was moving my German units in, as you do, from the flanks, trying to get into this set of buildings here, and I did successfully. Look at this nice little juicy target right there. That is so close. It's like a leapfrog into cover and a leapfrog into the factory. Well, and I'm pretty sure this is the building. Dave had set up a DC, as you can do, and he fell back as per normal, and then there's stupid me. I send in my 2 or 3 squads of pioneers with the leader. Doesn't he blow it? Doesn't he rubble the building and kill off a whole platoon of engineers? Because this was such an obvious target that I failed to recognize. Dave right away realized eventually I'm going to have to get to this building. It's almost natural because look at this open ground all around it. So you want to keep your guys under cover. As a defender, you have to be aware of situations like this. This might be a good spot to have your guns pre-register so you can bore sight. Or you could fortify it in such a way like a set DC and blow it when the enemy units enter it. But a very costly mistake for me to not see that. And this is where, as an attacker, by the way, you want to do things like searching. Before you commit your units, you want to search locations, see if you can identify potential booby traps. Yes, it's slow. However, I lost a platoon of engineers. So, again, because of the deliberate nature of this defense, you're able to set up as a defender things like set DCs, wire that will channel them through the building. Why delay through the wire when you have an open route? Again, more experienced players than me will notice that, and it's almost so obvious. It's like, why would you do it in the first place? But again, that comes with experience. So let's look at one last example. So here's again, we're back to Wacht am Rhein. This is number 1 at New Boy. So we have Germans. This is the first day of Battle of the Bulge. We have Germans that are going to be assaulting up through the woods, punching through these 2 strong points, and trying to, again, capture buildings in the city hex. So the Germans will win a game end if there are no good order American MMC or mobile AFVs with functioning MA on any hex within 3 of K5. So any 3 hexes of K5, you basically got to control all these buildings. Not super difficult. However, again, as an attacker, your forces as a defender, your units are very limited. So you've got, in this case, we have 7 cloak encounters. We've got 2 squads and 2, I think it's 3 squads and like 2 half squads, something like that. So I managed to break up another squad into half squad components. Not a lot of units. You've only got 5 squad equivalents to defend this from all of this coming aboard, including a platoon of engineers. And you're limited, again, by SSR into setting up 2 strong points initially of all your units. So this would be an example of, again, a depth or layer defense as well as a deliberate defense. So you have obstacles. We've got a lot of wire, which is going to slow them down. We have a gap. And, of course, we have our gaps covered with fires. We have machine guns and our other tools available to help should anything want to punch through this. They have no vehicles, so we don't have to worry about anti-armor. We just need a lot of machine gun fire to whittle them away. But again, we look at our time constraint. We have 8 turns. We know that they're going to be at least 1 turn moving into position to get into the edge of the tree line. Then they're going to have to assault through our minefield belt. Then they're going to have to break through our defenses and finally get into the town. So we've got 8 turns to delay. Now, as an attacker, you have to decide which way I'm going to go, left, right, up the center. For this one, I went up the right side. So these guys, because I had no reserve, once I committed to this flank as an attacker, the defenders all started moving back in to protect the town itself. Right? There's no point manning positions that are not going to be used. I could have left I think I left my machine gun here just to help cover the obstacles. Remember, overlapping fields of fire. And I did have a dummy stack here just to help flesh out the numbers, thinking I could draw some fire. Germans come up this flank. Now they're in the woods. And between this machine gun and this machine gun, we're trying to keep their heads down as long as possible. But they have to eventually breach our minefield, which they do. And they have enough firepower with A38s and 4.67s and LMGs that this will not stay very long. Once these guys start breaking, then they have to start retreating. Right? And again, we've already sent this strong point back to the town to reinforce. They're going to start setting up in applicable buildings, ready to do their job. Even if it's a dummy stack, it's still, until he's determined it's a dummy stack, he still has to treat it as a threat. And we'll get into how to use dummy stacks in a second. So that's some examples of the different types of defense. You have deliberate hasty, you have a hedgehog, and then you have the in-depth or layered defense. Clearly, the latter is the best choice, but typically you don't have enough numbers, units-wise, guns, and the map may just be untenable for that kind of approach. So you may have to have some variation if you can keep them to the outside. Again, at the end of the day, time is your friend. Usually you have some, but the attacker doesn't have enough. And you want to delay it as much as possible using the things we just talked about. All right, let's look at some miscellaneous things. So this is Hamlet's Demise. It's in A100. And it is early war, 13 May 1940. So we have Germans that are punching through. This is the Blitzkrieg. And the French are trying to defend this small little village. And again, we want to delay 6 turns because the victory conditions say, provided at the end of the game they have amassed 16 CVP, they'll win, provided the French have not amassed 20 of their own CVP. Again, victory conditions are always written from the perspective of the attacker. So the Germans win at game end if they have amassed at least 16, while denying the French 20 CVP. So your job as a French is to try and kill at least 20 CVP, bearing in mind what each of these vehicles is worth. Again, we have 5, 5, 5. I believe these ones would be 5 as well. Right there, that's 15 CVP. If you can destroy these 3 armor pieces, then you're 3/4 of the way there. Yeah, 5. All right, and you're 5 as well. All right, so like we said, we got 3 pieces of armor. Low armor, though, only 3 armor factors. And you do have access to a long gun, 25 double long, which will have no problem pending these kinds of things. Of course, the question is where do you put it? So when you're setting up in the defense, you have to consider about when do you drop concealment, because being concealed is your friend. And it prevents you from, or it hinders the enemy when they try and shoot at you, having your firepower. However, if you're not shooting back, that means they're going to be able to move willy-nilly. So at some point, you're going to have to make that decision. When do you drop concealment? So the case may be, in this case, we got a half squad scout forward. This first unit, using armored assault, say, moves on. You have to decide, is a 237 going to do a 2 flat attack? Well, there will be a -1 for the flamethrower, but everything else will be protected by the armor because of armored assault rules. You'll have a 2 flat shot. Now look at your snipers, whatever snipers at. We have a 3 for the Germans and a 4. So you're looking at a 2 firepower shot. 3 is a German sniper. And you need to roll a 6 or less to get a result against this stacking unit, with again a -1 for the flamethrower. You have to gauge, is it time to drop this or do I keep it? Now, in this particular case, he's more of a sacrificial half squad. This is something we'll cover in the attacker video, when to use sacrificial half squads. But in this case, there's probably no reason why you wouldn't drop it and take that shot. These units in depth would probably retain their concealment as long as possible. Wait for them to get closer. There's no point this guy shooting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's long range. He's firing through an orchard, and he has units under armored assault. So we're looking at 2 firepower with a +1. Again, he's got a 3 sniper. We're on the 2 table. He's got a 3 sniper, and we have a +1, which means we now have to roll a 5 or less. You know, if you remember the bell curve for your dice rolls, your average rolls were usually around 7, 6, 7, 8 is your typical rolls. You may get some rolls, you may get lucky. On the other hand, you could miss. And if you miss, you've just sacrificed your concealment for no purpose. So a reason why you might want to keep your concealment, say these 2 guys move in, they make it this far, you've not shot, you now move in, you're under a close combat, you decide as a defender, I'm not going to attack back. So now these guys are going to be 4 firepower because they're half, because you're concealed, against 4. A 1-to-1 on close combat is a 5 or less. Alright, so in this case, they missed. You're not locked in melee now because you're still concealed and you're not engaged. So you're still under CC, not melee. Now it's your turn as the French. You drop this in your prep fire phase, and now you've just fired triple firepower point blank into their faces. So you went from a 4 to a 12 with a +2. All right, so that's a reason why you may want to keep your concealment whenever possible. Again, the trade-off: do you blast him as he comes close, or do you wait until he enters your hex? And then if the odds ratio is in your favor, you may want to keep your concealment as long as possible, so that you can blast him in your own prep fire phase. All right, let's look at this example here. So this is something that Dave and I are currently playing right now. Last Minute War. It's from Journal number 148, and this is actually pre-start of hostilities, March 39. And we have Hungarians in defense versus Slovakians coming on board. So what had happened is, and this is where that second bullet comes in, don't move your units through location. David moved on. He had a fire base up here on the first level eventually. I had units here that were actually in trenches. This is a different setup than what I had. I had something like this set up. So I had units in trenches, and I made a huge brain fart. I had this guy hip here. This is a 20 long. This is my secret weapon in case that Slovakian plane causes some chaos, or any one of these 4 armored cars where the tank comes in the range. He was supposed to stay hip and surprise, but I didn't do that. I had a unit here in a trench. He was coming up from this flank, and I moved my unit through this location. Now, he has a fire base up here, and the fire base can see the target hex. I didn't even think about it. He fired, and remember, even if you're hip, if you sustain any fire, your unit becomes unhip and you suffer results. Well, these guys, first of all, unhip. There goes my sense of surprise, and they also broke in the subsequent result because they're only low morale troops. So because I made a huge blunder of walking through a location with hip units, Dave was able to basically deal him a full blow, and that basically collapsed this whole front, allowing his guys to come in this way. The scenario is very dicey. I don't know if the Hungarians are going to be able to hold on, but it was not aided by the fact that I just gave away my position. So whenever you have hip units, don't be waltzing your troops through them. Whenever possible, you want to draw them away. You don't want to draw attention to your factory or hip unit. You want to leave it as a hidden unit like this one is here, because you want these guys to be a gotcha kind of moment when they move a tank in the wrong way, maybe presents its rear to you or its flank to you. That's when you pop your guns and you start blasting, assuming you can't kill it outright. But just a note, whenever you set units up in hip, do not be walking your visible units through those locations. All right, so let's look at another example then for this using dummy stacks. So this here is scenario C, which is a combination of scenarios A and B. It's original squad leader converted over to ASL, and it's Stalingrad. All right, so we have a full map board, and we have various units set up here, including dummies on both sides. So this is a dummy stack for the Germans, and we also have one for the Russians. Now, how to use dummy stacks. This is an urban terrain, so it might be a little bit different it will be different in an open area. You're going to have less cover, and you're going to have to use your stacks a little bit more selectively. In this case, because we have two different objectives, we basically have controlling stone on this side, we have controlling the factory on this side, and in this side on the left, we have the Germans in defense, while on the right, they're on the attack. So it's a really good scenario because it's got a lot of moving pieces in it. And when you combine both scenarios together, and that's what this dashed line here is to separate the two map halves, when you combine it together in scenario C, it's a really three-dimensional war that you're fighting here. So because you have units for Russians, for example, you can support your attack on the left and then swing over to the right. Or you can engage these Germans and therefore make it easier on your dudes in the factory. So it's, again, a lot of flexibility. But at any rate, dummy counters. So on the right side of the map, the Russians has 8 dummy counters that you can use. This is how I put them up. Meanwhile, you've got the rest of your units around it ready to absorb. Now this is probably not the best way to do it. Let's switch that around. We want to have your dummy stacks for two purposes. The first one is to give the appearance that you have more than you actually have. All right, you want your dummies to be the ones that soak up all of the damage. So in this case, we have the, and this one is a dice off to see who goes first. You roll to see which side goes first. So if the German is lucky enough to fire in his prep fire, he has a chance of whittling away some of your units, and we presented him with 2 dummy stacks. So you want your dummy stacks in the front, like we said, to absorb the fire. So in this one, because it's a dice off to see who goes first, we could have Germans or Russians going first. The objective on this side of the map is to hold this building as long as possible, in which case the Russians are the defending in this half. You want to retain your concealment as long as possible because you're going to have a lot of fire coming at you. You have a limited number of turns. There's only, in the combined scenario, there's only 7 turns to play. And the German has to occupy this building here. So the forces that they have are really, it seems impressive, but it's really not, considering you got to move across all this open space. Now, you are rather dense. Wouldn't it be nice to drop an OBA in there, but the Germans don't have any. And you could spend a turn shooting as an attacker, whittling away the defense, or you could be moving. Again, we'll get into that with the attacker part. But for dummy stacks, again, I'm not the best guy to use those. You want to put them in places that give the appearance that you have more units than you do. Obviously, you could, and this is where psychology comes into play. If you know your opponent really well, you could psych them out. You could use your dummy stacks in unforeseen places, like maybe on your key objectives. Normally, you'd want to put your strongest troops there, but maybe initially your strongest troops are forward. Your dummy stacks are occupying the center, and your opponent's thinking you have a bunch of dummy stacks in front, and your real troops are behind. So, but again, that's psychology. It gets a little bit outside the weeds, into the weeds. Not the focus of this video, unless you're a master in psychology. But it's something to consider is how best to use your dummy stacks. You want to draw fire, preferably on these guys rather than your real. On the other hand, if this fire base opens up and I've just deleted that dummy stack, I've now given myself an easy avenue into the building. So again, it's a trade-off of how you use them, but you got to use them in such a fashion to A, draw fire, or B, give the appearance that a flank is protected better than it maybe really is. Again, this goes along with your defense, how many resources do you have to drop on, and this is one reason why scenarios with low OB counts are very difficult to defend, because you just don't have enough resources. And you throw in the random card of the sniper, and you could really be in the hurt locker if you have a decent sniper activation number. All right, so when do we fall back as a defender? In this case here, let's look at the left side of this scenario. So here we have Germans defending, and the Russians must occupy some of these German buildings. At least, I believe it's 3 out of the 5 they must control. And then you have to decide as a German, do I stay and fight, or do I fall back and try and retake the ground? Now, this one here is very difficult to play for the Germans because you've got a dozen 628s. One tactic that is some people use is the human wave to come across. Maybe not the best. It gives you a boost of morale and extra move, but you're still going to be moving in the open. And while it will allow you to enter an enemy's hex, you still have to negotiate this open terrain here where you're going to get just hammered to shit. I've never seen a human wave work successfully. Again, barring shitty dice rolls, and how the defender sets up will determine whether or not it's feasible to try a human wave. Because of line of sight restrictions, you may want to, in this case, set up all the way here. This way you don't give him a target to do a human wave, but you've just opened all this area up for him to take into. And 628s with their assault fire are nothing to sneeze at. Even if you come into this location and then dash into here, one at a time, you're going to start whittling him away. But the minute you fire at this guy, used up your first fire, assuming you fired everybody, which would not be advisable, the rest of these guys can just park themselves 2 hexes away and they'll blast you. All right. So as a defender, you again got to make that decision. Do you set up forward where you're going to be taking your lumps, or do you set up in depth and sacrifice space for safety and concealment? Sustained fire. So when it comes to things like guns, I am not at all adverse to shooting. I've just fired my shot. I really need to pen this thing. For whatever reason, my shot failed. I have no qualms about intensive firing, unless I have a circled breakdown number, low ammo capability, that kind of thing. I'm not averse to firing, which has cost me several times, because remember your breakdown goes down by 2 when you intensive fire, so it's now a 10 to break it, and a 12 will disable it. So you got to bear that in mind. But again, it's a question of how risky do you want to be and whether or not you need to take that shot. If it's early in the game, maybe not so much requirement to intensive fire, but if you have a large stack coming at you, and because again your numbers are not the greatest, say we don't have these units here, they're held back here for some reason, you have to try and defend your assets as much as possible, which may require you to intensive fire. Again, it's not recommended usually. Myself, I have no qualms about it. If I lose the gun, I'm probably going to lose this tank anyways once these guys get close enough to jump on me in close combat. Again, assuming none of the surrounding infantry are in play. If my armor is very vulnerable, there's a very good chance that I'm going to intensive fire to try and live a little bit longer. All right, so in this case, we're going to go back to our last minute war, and we have our defenders. Now, what I like to do, and this comes down to sighting MGs and fire lanes, is I like to start with my big guns first. Everybody's got their own way of doing things. You have to consider, okay, so how is the enemy going to approach? Now, this goes into the terrain analysis, which I didn't really go over, but I think I've done enough videos with initial recce's to get the idea. You look at the terrain, okay? So we have no covered approaches this way. We have no covered approaches this way. There's a lot of stuff over here which could conceivably be used to have a covered approach. However, it's a little bit slower. Where is he going to be attacking from? You really have no idea. So you have to pick the best case that you can do. And this is, again, going to be hugely dependent on the resources you have available. So for us, we've got a 37 long, and we have to find a spot for it. Knowing he's going to come on this way, probably some kind of armored assault, maybe. I would use armored assault. That might be not a bad spot because you have a nice covered arc this way. You could put him in the house. The problem with this location here is he's going to die in that location. Once he becomes known, once he drops his hip status and he starts shooting, he's very susceptible to being targeted and destroyed. And then your biggest piece is gone. You do have to worry about 4 armored cars and a tank, and that's his only real anti-armor besides hand-to-hand is the AT. Now these are 0 armor class, armor factor armored cars, which you could penetrate with a machine gun. The kill for that is a 4, barring range and rear shot. MGs are typically 4. If we had a 50 cal, it would be 5. Wouldn't that be great? And if you can get them real close range, you'll get bonuses to your kill number. But it's still a relatively low roll you're going to need to take out the armored car, but it is doable. So if you lose your 37 long, that is a major asset. So you probably want to maybe keep him back. This is not a bad spot because you have a nice long shot right down the center, and you can help cover your flank. All right, so you can cover this covered arc, and this will cover up many approaches that they may want to take. Once you plop this thing in the building, you cannot take it out in the course of a game. Games are a bit different. For a hassle, you're allowed some freedom of reorientating your guns. But generally speaking, in the course of a normal scenario, you will not be able to move once you put them in place. So you got to be careful where you sight them. Our other piece is we have a 20 long AA gun. I was thinking maybe back here originally with the sole purpose of keeping him in AA mode. So this way you don't have to pay the penalty, and his sole purpose at that point will be to shoot the enemy planes down. All right, you can park him in AA mode. Again, they set up hip at start because they're in concealable terrain. So remember what he said before, if you have a hip unit, don't be waltzing units through it. Try and avoid that area as much as possible. Don't be staring at it when you're playing somebody face to face, because that's a good tell that you have something hidden there. And remember, when you're face to face, which is something you don't get from Vassal, is the psychological component we alluded to. If you know where your opponent is counting hexes from, you have a good idea that something is hidden there. All right, so you want to have a lot of this stuff pre-planned, or hip shoot, as it were. You don't want to give away the game by looking at your hex where your gun is, and then you're doing some mental math, your mouth's moving because you're counting out loud, that kind of thing. All right. This might not be a bad spot, but again, why would you set up here? Well, we have a couple of things to do. One is we can protect these 3 buildings when we're in the ground roll. We can target something that's moving in the open here as well. So a surprise gotcha. It's back in depth, which means he's eventually going to have to secure these buildings. And that's not a bad spot to put it. Or you could maybe sight it forward. Again, maybe place in the AA roll automatically so that when that plane shows up, you can deal with it if required. And then I sight my heavy guns first. And then I do my next heaviest weapon, which in this case is my machine guns. I have 2 mediums. I have to think, okay, how can I best support my two anti-tank guns, and how can I take advantage of these huge, beautiful kill zones that they have to walk through, while at the same time being able to withdraw. So this is a likely target or destination to set up because it gives you a lot of good advantage. But again, you got to be aware of your enemy's order of battle as well. He's got a heavy as well as a couple of machine guns. What if he parks his ass up here on the first level? You're now going to have a gun duel. You look at your leadership. You have an 8-1. He has a 9-1, I think it is. Yeah, he's got a 9-1 and an 8-1. Oh, you have a 9-1 as well. So do you put your 9-1, 8-1 forward with a medium to cover this open area, knowing you're probably going to get shot? Or do you set him up and back, saves his bacon from being shot initially, and he's offered some kind of protection, and he can still contribute once units start getting close? So again, something you're going to have to decide. Where do you put your other one best supporting? Like maybe right here? Because you still have a nice lane of fire down into this way. You help protect this flank, and you help protect your gun. At the same time, you also offered a little bit of flexibility. You can come back into the town and help out the other flank if required, and vice versa. All right, so I sight my heavies first, and then I sight my next lowest one, and then I basically plot in the rest of the units in various locations. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll set up my dummy stacks to fill voids from my real units. So let's do this quickly here. All right, so this is my defense. I've got 2 half squads forward like scouts. Their purpose is to deny these guys from waltzing in with concealment. So they're going to strip their concealment away. They're going to die very quickly. If they don't, they always have a chance of retreating. But these guys are basically forward scouts to identify the enemy. Now we got to flesh out my defenses. So maybe I'll give them a juicy target up front. Again, I want to offer some protection in the back. The one thing you have to be careful about is, again, giving away the game, right? So everything is concealed. Let's conceal everything. And we don't know what is what as an attacker. Now, you have to consider, remember, dummy stacks can still move. They're not pinned to where they are, so moving them around sometimes might be best. The problem is with a location like this, there's no cover around it, which means the minute he moves out in the open, he's going to be seen. So that's not a good spot for him. Maybe back here would be a good spot. It kind of gives the illusion that he's being reinforced, this little pesky half squad, when in fact he's actually not. Just remember, you can always move your dummy stacks around in various locations. Again, this is a poor spot because once you leave the cover of the trees, you're probably going to lose your concealment. But it's a trade-off, right? You want to trade the illusion of cover where there's none, covering fire where there's none. At the same time, you want to have enough punch actually in that location to actually cause some damage. So using this kind of a setup, this is basically something similar to what I had against Dave. Dave attacked in a full spread across the front. His armored cars were on the left. He brought his conscripts up here on the right. And again, poor choices on my part led to basically the disintegration of this halfway through the game. And he started making his way here. Now, the last point in this slide here, highly mobile attacker. So Dave's done this to me many times, and I fall for it every time. I don't know why. He brought his armored cars up in, because he's a radialist, they have to move in a platoon. I was able to destroy 2 of these in the process. So basically we had, oh, not you. And he's able to move the rest of his armored cars. For whatever reason, these guys were unable to contribute. This guy was eventually lost his hip or his concealment, and he was first fired because of his units that were moving up. Then Dave decides to move his armored cars in. Doesn't he move them all the way back to here? Now he's behind me in my center. They can't occupy buildings, but I am now hugely hampered by the fact that his highly mobile attack has penetrated my defenses because, again, I was out of position. I had first fired, which means I couldn't do any street fighting when they come by you. You can only do reaction fire if they enter my hex, which they didn't. And therefore, they were able to freely come into this location, and now he basically has them parked like this in the center of my little village, which means anytime I'm broken and want to fall back, I cannot do it because of these guys. These guys will deny my route. He's now cut me off from crossing the road with his coax. It's only 4 firepower, but still, a 4 down 2 is going to be ridiculous. Can maybe dash and deal with it, but by his mobile attack, he's able to penetrate my defenses, and now he's behind me. And their job is going to be to cut off routing. This also worked in Stalingrad. So you can buy, I think it's armored cars in Stalingrad, or trucks or half tracks. At any rate, I'd set up as a Russian defender. Dave, on day one, bought every vehicle that he could, mounted up all his troops, and punched right through my line. He was behind my front line at the end of the first day. So you have to be wary. Looking at the OB, is your attacker very mobile? Again, psychology-wise, if you've played a person before, you understand how aggressive they can be, or how timid they can be, and you can use this to your advantage to help punch through. But you got to be aware of that as a defender. All right, so one of the problems with making a video like this is every scenario is fairly unique in terms of requirements, victory conditions, orders of battle, SSRs, what have you. There's so many variables, it's difficult to cover everything in a condensed video like this one is. So I'm hoping that I've given you the basics on things to consider when you're setting up your defense. You must understand the victory conditions and the SSRs. The victory conditions are always written from the perspective of the attacker. And as a defender, your mission is to deny those victory conditions, whether it's through attrition, you gaining as much CVP as you can, or denying him space or exiting from the map board. You deny him his victory condition, and therefore you win. You have to use the terrain to your advantage. You have to understand how moving works, when it's likely that they're going to use bypass, how fast they are, do they have a lot of mobile assets? All these kinds of things you're going to have to factor in. It's going to impact how you set up your defense. You have to weight the time versus terrain ratio. So how much time do you spend forward positions to give up ground? Do you give up ground? You can't do both. You have to do one or the other. So you're going to have to hold on, ideally just long enough to delay him. Then you're going to fall back into prepared positions, hopefully, and then delay him and so forth until you run out the clock, basically. When you're setting up your defenses, make sure you have lots of overlapping and interlocking arcs of fire. You want to cover your obstacles with fire whenever possible. That's just real world defensive strategy. There's no point in having a minefield if you don't have anything to shoot at it, because you're especially vulnerable when you're in things like minefield wire. When you start factoring hazardous moving it open, that kind of thing, it makes it easier to take down enemy units, and you have to make sure you have enough firepower available to cover all that, again, depending on the map. You want to try and limit or slow the enemy's routes. So if you have wire defenses, you maybe want to put them in a spot that will channel him through a certain direction, or at a minimum, just slow him down so you can always recover and use your reserve, which you should have, to plug in where the new attack is coming from. Use them on your flanks, maybe to protect the side end runs and that kind of thing. You have to know when to drop concealment and when to fire, and when do you hold on to it. Whenever possible, try and retain it unless you have a good shot. Any down 2 shots probably good, even on the 1 table. Don't forget your residual and your fire lanes. One thing we never talked about is setting up your MGs on ground level so you can have fire lanes. And just put down a lot of residual fire. That'll help slow down the enemy as well and force him to come by different routes. Very fast attackers that have a lot of mobility, armored cars, half-tracks, trucks, what have you, tanks. A lot of them will be able to punch through your lines, and once they get behind you, they'll be able to prevent you from routing that way. Tanks don't take prisoners, and you don't invoke no quarter when a tank eliminates you for failure to route. So again, tanks don't take prisoners, which means you're gone for failure to route, but you don't invoke no quarters. So it's a very important strength that armor gives you in that perspective. Again, having a reserve to plug holes. Now in this case, because of my elements, I don't have enough to deal with this. Again, maybe if I would have had my anti-air gun there, it might not be bad. I could have taken a shot. A 20 long would have no problem penetrating a 0 armor factor armor car. But I didn't. I was out of position, and I had no reserve to deal with this. Now I have to detach units from the front to come back and deal with this. My guns are out of position completely. And then I'll just reinforce the fact, if you have HIP units, do not be waltzing your units through those hexes, because you're going to get a shot out of nowhere. You inadvertently just hit and revealed your surprise gotcha at the wrong time. Completely ineffective, and now they're broken. They're in a building trying to recover, while the unmanned gun, never even got a shot off, is sitting parked there in the field. So hopefully that's given you, again, some ideas on what works and what doesn't work in a defense. And what I do it, again, I'm by no means a master of defense. I always struggle with it. But if you take the basics that we've covered and use it as a base, it might help your game in the future. Again, I sight my big guns first, then I sight my machine guns, and then I fill in with squads. I think that's probably the best way to do it. You want to give your biggest punch the best shots. And again, in this particular case, bore sighting, because the units are coming from off board, I could actually pick targets like maybe this intersection, put in a bore sight in that location, and that just helps me hit things when they're moving through it. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a little bit of guesswork on where you pick for your bore sights. But again, it's something that you have to do, and you have to bear in mind. Maybe you'll be lucky enough and you'll find a spot like this house here, or maybe this house here, that eventually the enemy is going to have to get to, and then you can use that for your bore sighting if you had already had that pre-planned. So again, that's basically what Tactics 101 defending the Wii version is. Let me know what you guys think. If I'm off the mark, if I've missed things, I can definitely do a follow-up video. Maybe I'll go more in depth, make it a 201. But we just wanted to cover the basics of defense in ASL and how that applies. So hopefully this is some use. Again, let me know what you think, and we'll see you guys next video. Bye-bye.